The Democratic People's Republic of Korea has, since the 1960s and 70s, maintained an armored vehicles industry that produces vehicles to meet the needs of a Korean People's Army that struggles to get modern foreign vehicles imported. Though this initially started with fairly simple armored personnel carriers like the 323 and tanks like the M-1981 or Chomaho, North Korea would quickly start developing vehicles which require more significant development efforts. The M-1989 or M-1992 self-propelled anti-aircraft gun is a good example of one of the more advanced vehicles North Korea was able to field from the late 1980s onward. Hello and welcome to another Tank Encyclopedia voiced article. I'm your host Tony, and today I'll be covering one of the most modern North Korean self-propelled anti-aircraft guns, the M-1989. If you like our videos and want to support us, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be used to improve future Tank Encyclopedia content. Any help would be greatly appreciated. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea or DPRK, often just known as North Korea, ever since its inception in the months following the end of World War II, has been an adversary to the Republic of Korea ROK. While the DPRK formed the pro-Soviet North with a hard branch of Marxist-Leninist ideology that would evolve into its own ideology combining socialist and nationalistic elements, Juche. The South, despite being for much of its history a dictatorial regime as well, would be closely aligned with the United States. The 1950 to 1953 Korean War demonstrated the Americans and their side of the peninsula's capacities to take air superiority and use it to massively handicap the movement's combat capacities and also daily functioning of the northern country via massive bombings. Air defense has, as such, been a major concern for the DPRK. Fixed air defense, for example, comes in the form of a vast ring of missile and artillery batteries around the capital, Pyongyang, but there's also the mobile air defense of its military forces. This materialized as early as the first days of the new North Korean army in 1948, with trucks armed with anti-aircraft machine guns, but North Korea's self-propelled anti-aircraft guns would mostly blossom from the 1970s onward. There were several factors for this. One was the fact that North Korea had developed a vast armored vehicles manufacturing industry, eventually being able to manufacture its own vehicles. Another was the Soviet delivery of a small batch of ZSU-23-4s, Shilkas, which would provide a good technical basis. A first primitive self-propelled anti-aircraft gun mounted dual 37mm guns on the chassis of the Tokchon series of self-propelled artillery pieces, known as the M-1978. A few years later, M-1985 was introduced. It used a hull directly based on the Shilka's GMZ-575 hull. However, its armament was still primitive, basically using the ZSU-57-2's 1950s dated weapon system with no form of radar guidance. A great leap forward was still needed to bring North Korea's self-propelled anti-aircraft artillery to a reasonably modern level. This would at least partly be accomplished by the vehicle known by the US Department of Defense (DoD) as the M-1989. It ought to be noted that this vehicle has also been known as the M-1992 by the same US DoD. For the sake of clarity, this article will solely use the M-1989 designation. It also ought to be noted that this year-based designation is based on the year the vehicles was first observed in service. It is very common for the vehicle to have been in service with the DPRK for several years by the point it is first seen by Western observers. In the case of M-1989, while its development is extremely nebulous, as the DPRK's always is, it appears American intelligence reported having spotted the prototype as early as late 1983, suggesting a development process concentrated around or at least starting in the early 1980s. The M-1989's armament is based on the Soviet AK-230 naval gun. North Korea gained access to this gun along with OSA-class missile boats and Sosoniaru-class torpedo boats in the 1960s. The OSA and Sosoniaru torpedo and missile boat classes had been the first ships to mount the AK-230, each operating two of the dual guns, one at the bow and one at the stern. The guns were guided by an MR-104 drum-tilt pulse-only radar system. As CVIS, these guns have been designed with the task of potentially destroying missiles, which, even more so than an anti-aircraft role, would require a very fast rate of fire. To solve this problem, Soviet engineers designed the two guns that would be present in one AK-230 system as four rifle-barreled revolver cannons, each firing at 1,000 rounds per minute and disposing of a 500 rounds belt. Their barrels were 1,930 mm long, and the guns overall were 2,670 mm long and weighed in at 155 kg each. This gun system would fire electrically primed 30 by 210 mm rounds, which had been purposely designed for the system. Two types were provided: a 1.12 kg explosive round with an explosive charge of 30 grams of the standard Soviet A-92 explosive, and an armor-piercing trace round weighing in at 10 grams heavier, 1.13 kg, but fired at the same muzzle velocity of 1050 meters per second. When looking at the AK-230's performances, it is easy to see some favorable points in comparison to the ZSU-23-4's main armament, despite the latter being more than decent when first introduced. Though the rate of fire of the Shilka's quad armament would be superior, 3,400 to 4,000 rounds per minute total, in comparison to 2,000 rounds per minute from the AK-230. The naval gun offered slightly higher velocity and larger shells. This resulted in a longer effective range, spanning up to around 4 km in good conditions and still up to 2.5 in worse ones, while 2.5 km were generally considered around the limit of the Shilka's effective firing range, which would go down further in bad conditions. The larger shells also packed a higher punch, which would result in more destructive potential by a limited number of hits, particularly at range. These advantages likely pushed North Korea engineers to try and adapt the AK-230 into a self-propelled anti-aircraft gun design. It ought to be noted that the KPAN only used the AK-230 in a very limited number of designs ever since it started the mass production of missile and torpedo boats. Indigenous North Korean designs, however, appear to more often than not retain the primitive 25mm 2M3 autocannon, using only optical guidance. As such, the choice to study a version of the AK-230 for the Army, despite the gun seeing limited use in the branch it was originally used by, the Navy, shows the high priority which was given to providing good air cover to North Korea's armed forces, particularly its armored divisions and regiments. North Korea's AK-230 base design was placed into a turret very similar to the one found on the ZSU-23-4 in terms of general architecture, but appears to be higher, more rectangular, and perhaps simpler. It is a fairly large rectangular turret with large stowage boxes on both sides. At the turret center, a high-elevation gun mount allows the target system to engage all types of aircrafts. To the rear center of the turret, as on the ZSU-23-4, the M-1989 features a radar, though in appearance it is quite similar to the Shilka's RPK-2 Topol. The radar used by North Korea's vehicle is thought to most likely have still been based on the MR-104 drum tilt, mainly for the reason that radar had been purposely designed to operate with the AK-230. As pretty much systematically for North Korea, it is quite impossible to see how much the armament may have been modified, as no internal views of the vehicle are known to exist. Modifying the AK-230 to fit alongside the crew within the turret of an armored vehicle likely required some significant modifications. For example, the 500-round belts would perhaps not have been very practical and changed for a shorter belt, perhaps similar to the 50-round belts found in classic Shilka. The use of electrically primed projectiles, in addition to the high electrical needs already created by a turret with a high rotational speed and the presence of a radar, would perhaps have required higher electricity generation capacities. His gun system would also likely add some weight to the original ZSU-23-4 to a moderate extent, perhaps nearing about 20 tons total. The crew likely consists of 4, as on the ZSU-23-4, with a driver in the hull, and a commander, gunner, and crewman operating the radar in the turret. When North Korea first designed a Shilka-inspired self-propelled anti-aircraft gun in the form of the M-1985, the hull chosen for the vehicle was a fairly close version of the GMZ-575 chassis, originally used by the ZSU-23-4. A few different details appeared nonetheless. The North Korean model appeared to have different side stowage, with 4 stowage hatches to be found instead of 3 on the Shilka. The glasses may be angled a few degrees further back. While the M-1985 lacked them, the M-1989 appears to reintroduce towing hooks, though it only uses 2 instead of the Shilka's 3. The North Korean chassis also appears to use different tracks, with a central pin and 2 side pads. Its tracks appears to be more tension, generally resting higher, and it appears to use starfish-type road wheels similar to those found in Soviet main battle tanks rather than the stamped steel type used in lighter vehicles such as the PT-76 or the ZSU-23-4. There is no way to know if the North Korean version of the GMZ-575 retains the propulsive elements of the Shilka or instead moved to use another engine. The GMZ-575 chassis was originally based on the PT-76 light tank, which North Korea is thought to have assembled at the Sinhong tank plant in the late 1960s and 1970s. Therefore, it is likely the chassis was relatively easy to start to manufacture. North Korea operates a number of other vehicles in a similar weight range, notably the variety of vehicles based on the 323 Armored Personnel Carrier and the M-1981 light tank. It is not impossible to think the North Koreans may have tried to introduce some part commonality between their fleet, but this is pretty much just conjecture. If the North Korean version is believed to have similar capacities to the original GMZ-575, for example, if it kept the V6P1 280 horsepower diesel engine or used a power plant of similar capacities, it likely means the M-1989 should be able to reach a maximum speed of about 50 km per hour. Overall, it would be somewhat less mobile than main battle tanks, armored personnel carriers, and infantry fighting vehicles due to a lower power-to-weight ratio. Production of the M-1989 started at some point during the 1980s, seeing as it used the same hull as the M-1985. The more advanced M-1989 likely took the first type succession on North Korea production chains. In comparison to the previous M-1985, the M-1989 brought massive improvements. While the M-1985 itself had been a major progress from the M-1978 and various ZPU-4 systems mounted on hulls based on the 323 APCs, it still offered a primitive armament, albeit in the form of a truly dedicated purpose-built air defense system. The M-1989 took that base, the hull basically, and mounted an at least somewhat capable radar-guided armament on it. The M-1989 could hardly be called state-of-the-art by its 1980s introduction. It obviously paled in comparison to modern systems introduced in the 1980s, such as the Soviet Tu-M22 Tunguska with its missile batteries, advanced radar, and newer 30mm guns. But it was still likely an improvement from the ZSU-23-4 Shilka in terms of firepower. And while the Shilka was a quite old design by the 1980s, it has still proven to be an effective one which was considerably feared by NATO in its prime days of the 1960s and 70s. Even with a fairly primitive radar, a similar vehicle featuring somewhat longer-reaching guns was a significant addition to the Korean People's Army arsenal and could pose a solid threat to the helicopter and close air support plane fleets that would be operated by South Korea and the United States in case of a conflict. Ever since it was first seen in the late 1980s, the M-1989 has been a regularly recurring sight in the military parade in which DPRK flexes its military and military-industrial muscles. The M-1989 is the most often seen of all North Korean self-propelled anti-aircraft guns ever since its introduction, this trend continuing in recent parades. Nonetheless, it does not appear to be the latest self-propelled anti-aircraft gun. An even more advanced model known as the M-1994 is said to exist. It also uses an armament based on Soviet Seawiz, but instead of the AK-230, it takes the basis of the AK-630 30mm rotary autocannon, firing shorter 30 by 165mm shells at a whopping 5,000 rounds per minute, while also featuring 2 radars. One radar is for long-range target acquisition, and the other for short-range tracking. It would also feature some optional side boxes for light anti-air missiles, likely a local version of the Igla. All in all, it sounds like a potent and particularly innovative vehicles by the DPRK standard. No photos or iconographic documents of it appear to have transpired and be publicly available though, and as such, how operational such a system may be is questionable. By what can be readily observed of the Korean People's Army, an obviously limited insight into what is going on in its entirety, seeing the secretive nature of the country and its armed forces, the M-1989 appears to be the most common self-propelled anti-aircraft gun in North Korea's service, as well as most likely the most modern one available in any significant number. In comparison to the vehicle it was based on, the M-1989 may have brought some genuine improvements, and have been fairly potent, if not state-of-the-art vehicle by the point it was introduced. In comparison to more modern vehicles though, the M-1989 slowly but surely starts to pale. Most significantly, it finds itself in the uneasy position of having to face some potent and well-equipped air forces. The Republic of Korea Air Force has not yet entirely retired its fleet of F-4 Phantom and F-5E Tiger II aircraft that may still prove to be vulnerable targets to the M-1989, as well as the Army's attack and transport helicopters fleet, which still rely on some older types such as upgraded version of the AH-1 Cobra. However, newer models of aircraft used by the South Korean Air Force may prove too much to be handled by the aging system. The threat of multi-role F-15s, F-16s, F-35s, T-50s, and in the future perhaps even the new KF-21 be used for precision strikes with anti-radiation missile or laser-guided bombs would likely leave the M-1989 and its 1960s vintage radar and much of North Korea's numerous but outdated anti-aircraft defenses in general unable to offer a credible defense. If the Korean conflict is to become hot again, the masses of North Korean armored vehicles already facing numerous but modern South Korean tanks would likely very much be under the threat of the South's aircraft, not even considering the tremendous air power that the US could potentially deploy. Despite all of North Korea's efforts, denying the skies with their potential enemies seemed to be too much of a hurdle to overcome for the isolated and impoverished Hermit Kingdom. This concludes our video on the North Korean M-1989. If you like this video, please leave a like and subscription. You can find more information relating to this vehicle in the full article which is linked in the description. If you like what we are doing and want to let us continue working on these videos, please consider donating on Patreon or PayPal. All of the funds will be allocated to improving our articles and videos for you. Until next time, keep us in your sights.